Hello. Our story begins with a weird interaction between the Chancellor of the Galactic Republic and the Jedi's Chosen One. It had been a full year since the Battle of Naboo, and the Chancellor was holding a ceremony at the Theed Palace. Invitations were being sent to Anakin, Obi-Wan, Master Yoda, and Master Windu to be present. The Queen was willing to comply with this request and welcomed all visitors. Captain Panaka was happy to see Obi-Wan once again. The Jedi, Chancellor, and Queen did the usual rounds by chatting it up during the party inside the palace. It was one of the large ballrooms, and the Chancellor walked about, greeting advisors, Jedi Masters, and finally, Anakin Skywalker. Aside from being the leader of the Free Republic, Palpatine was outfitted with jewelry of a king, something that hadn't been common for public appearances from him. The Jedi didn't pay much attention, they never really did, because why would a Sith Lord hide in plain sight, with his Sith artifacts all over his body? Similar to his office, these were ancient relics on his hand. The jewelry he wore consisted of a couple golden bracelets, a necklace from another Sith originally from Naboo, and a couple of rings. The rings came in a variety of sizes. One of them was a bit larger, and no one paid any mind to it. Palpatine greeted the young hero of the Battle of Naboo, and asked how his training was going for him. Skywalker tried to sound as professional as possible. He was both trying to impress the Queen, who was somewhere lurking at this event, and make sure Obi-Wan was content with his display of etiquette. Palpatine, sensing this, moved to enthusiastically commend Anakin. This was a tense atmosphere for someone so young. The Chancellor adjusted one of his rings while they were speaking. There was a thick ruby that covered the top of the ring, and he removed it as they talked about the youngling trials that were to come up in the next couple years. Palpatine avoided making a scene out of his jewelry adjustments, and he told Anakin that he could extend some good graces to the High Council if he needed. The boy rejected this, believing that he had to rightfully earn it. Palpatine used this once again to boost Anakin's ego, calling him mature beyond his years, informing him that the Jedi should be proud to have him in his ranks. He, with the ruby, twisted over inside the palm of his hand with a needle pointed downwards, patted Anakin's shoulder. Immediately, blood was drawn and Anakin winced. As Palpatine turned away, he heard this and asked Anakin what was wrong. The boy tapped his shoulder and the Chancellor profusely apologized, telling Anakin that these old jewels had some sharp edges. He didn't normally wear them. He'd have to get that fixed. He then revealed the ruby, which was now attached to the ring itself, as if it had been there the entire time. Now, though, it was beaming with a crimson glow, filled with blood. Anakin didn't think anything of it, but he complimented the jewel, and Palpatine smiled, before walking away as if nothing had happened. That would be the last of their interactions during the celebration, only 1 or 2 minutes long. Anakin and Padme would reunite at some point or another, but it wouldn't be as euphoric as he thought it would be. The Jedi would leave, the celebrations would end, and for Anakin, it'd be right back to the basics. Palpatine would send the ruby to Count Dooku on Sereno. Its classic jet black hair was fading fast, but he would take the ruby to Kamino. The Jango Fett clones were already moving through early year developments, but per the request of Darth Sidious, Lord Tyrannus informed the Kaminoans that they were going to be adding a second batch of clones. The scientists and cloners were confused by this immediate shift, but Dooku didn't come to give answers, he was giving direction. His master informed him of the why. The Kaminoans didn't need to know that. The DNA of Anakin Skywalker was given over, and they got to work immediately. The clone army at the beginning of the war would be around 200,000 units large, with 2 million more on the way. Per Dooku's ask, the majority of the clone army would end up being these Skywalker clones. Due to timing and such, the first 200,000 units would all be Jango Fett creations, including Alpha and Omega. The Kaminoans would call the male and female unmodified clones of Skywalker Omicron and Phi, the male being Omicron, the female being Phi. Dooku did not elaborate on the blood type, or who Skywalker was and what it meant for their cloning processes. He just wanted them to get the job done, and they prided themselves on their cloning techniques, so of course that's what they were going to do. The two Sith would continue to routinely check in on Kamino to further diagnose the progress of the army. Despite what the Kaminoans told Tyrannus, there'd be some minor complications throughout the cloning process for the, as they called it, Type B genome. The Type A was fine. Jango Fett's blood was not tampered with by midichlorians, whereas Type B, Anakin's blood, was filled with them. The Kaminoans knew very little about this, and again, Dooku didn't elaborate on it. He was just a messenger. The complications for the Type B clones wasn't terrible. They were easier to control, but less obedient, and they had noticeable anger problems. The big issue that continued to hit the cloners was that the Type B clones showed signs of the Force. Not all of them, but if they were to take a good count, about 50% of them had a chance to use the Force. This was beyond confusing, especially because the Type A clones had a minuscule chance of showing signs. Like, take for example, Omega, the female unmodified clone of the Type A batch, had a small midichlorian count, but she likely wouldn't be able to wield the Force. These other children, despite only being children throughout this process, were able to lift objects with their minds. They could crush vials or needles when frightened or upset. It was working with an entirely different batch of children that the cloners had never truly experienced before. The Kaminoans, though, were still masterminds of cloning, so they made their adjustments. They found methods to mute these powers, and the entirety of the clones' predisposition for using the Force, though it had to be noted by Nala Se that war could activate these, so they'd have to come up with other methods to make sure the Force never showed itself. Again, these were nothing more than minor complications. Some of it was shared with Tyrannus, but most of it was just stored inside the vault of notes held by Nala Se and the Kaminoan archives. Of course, cloning an individual with such a high sensitivity to the Force would do this, and not every clone of Anakin had the Force. But because the batch was so large, consisting of almost 2 million units, there was a higher chance for clones to show signs. This was integrated into their training regimens once the clones became cadets. They discouraged the usage of the Force widely, but individuals who had a harder time muting their powers, they encouraged it. So to help them, individuals that had killed or worked with Jedi before, but no longer shared loyalties to the Order, would be hired and brought in for work. They of course couldn't directly train individuals how to use the Force, but they understood the methods used by the Jedi, and did what they could to replicate it for the clones. Because this didn't directly change anything for Anakin, the Jedi, or Palpatine, all would go according to plan. Palpatine taking blood from Skywalker didn't stop him from attempting to assassinate Padme. The Queen still tried to free Anakin's mother in the aftermath of her troubles at home following the blockade, but Shmi was long gone by then. So came Geonosis, and the battle that changed the fate of the galaxy. The Clone Wars began also normally, because the clones never removed their helmets on Geonosis. Obi-Wan had seen some of the clones from afar during his visit, but he wasn't close enough to any of them to notice any differences. When Yoda went to retrieve the army, he didn't see the clones without their helmets on either, so no one knew. It wouldn't be until right after the Battle of Geonosis that the Jedi would be left in confusion, because there were thousands, possibly millions of clones who looked like young Skywalker. The Chosen One was in the medbay getting fixed up after losing his arm to Dooku. Padme was with him, because they were good friends. Yoda had his suspicions, but they dwindled quickly because there were more pressing matters. The surviving counselors gathered in an empty room following the battle and discussed this occurrence. How could it be that Anakin was the genotype for the clone army? It was clear that there was at least one other genome donor. Taun We didn't specifically mention the origin of the Type B clone, and why would Obi-Wan assume that it was Anakin? What precedent would anyone have to believe that nearly 2 million clones were Anakin Skywalker? The Jedi were alarmed and worried, but who could have done this? They didn't know about Anakin sneaking out of the temple on multiple occasions, so all they could draw off of were past missions with Obi-Wan. But even at that, Anakin didn't become a technical Padawan until he was 13. All of these clones, according to Taun We and the Prime Minister, Lama Su, were 10 years old or 9. Now, to preface, a majority of Anakin's clones didn't make it to Geonosis. Many of them were still training because they were younger, but there were more than a couple thousand of them working with the Jedi on Geonosis. There were quite a few clones who passed their cadet training faster than the others, even faster than some of the Jango clones. Most of these cases were Type Bs that had higher sensitivity to the Force. Regardless, the Council couldn't wait to get back to Coruscant. Master Windu and soon-to-be Counselor Obi-Wan Kenobi would confront the Senate to inform them of the battle on Geonosis and all it entailed. This essentially would bind the Jedi and the Republic into war against the Separatists. The rest of the Council would confront Anakin, and yes, it was very intentional to have both Obi-Wan and Mace away from this discussion. Ironically, despite everything, Anakin never saw the clones. He heard his voice muffled by the helmet, but he just thought that adrenaline was doing its thing. It wasn't until the Council requested his presence that he became suspicious. When he stood before them, he was grilled by various masters. The war had just begun and he was somehow a part of it before it ever started. Anakin was an anomaly to the Council in many ways. His ranging talents, his disinterest in regimental training, his rebellious habits, and now a clone army? He truthfully didn't know what they meant by this because it confused him, though this didn't help the Council all that much, because they believed he was lying to them. But they couldn't sense anything from him but surprise and a hint of defensiveness. Even if Anakin was lying, he wasn't that great of a liar anyways. They knew that because he had a knack for telling the truth, especially when it suited him. It would be especially relevant here because he could get in serious trouble if he did it. But he told them everything he knew. Of course, he wouldn't recount a brief moment from a celebration that happened 9 years ago. That would be ridiculous, and he was also still a kid. It was so out of his mind, and he honestly tried to walk them through missions he did after the fact. However, aside from the celebrations of Naboo's freedom, there was nothing he could specifically note of from such a long time ago. Even before that, why would someone pick a random slave kid on Tatooine? The only thing he did remember was Qui-Gon Jinn pricking him on Tatooine. This was a potential lead, but even at that, it was just a prick. That wasn't enough blood for an entire genetic template, unless the Kaminoans could multiply genetic cells and stretch the genome for a massive army. The Council dismissed Anakin, he wasn't in trouble, and they would consider looking into the prick sent by Qui-Gon. Because perhaps there was a scenario where Qui-Gon called it a prick, but it was much larger. Even at that though, unless there was another culprit, Qui-Gon couldn't get the blood to Kamino in that time frame. In all fairness to the High Council, there was a certain plot that existed here with Qui-Gon Jinn. Whether they believed he was capable or not, they didn't know, but from their perspective, with this being the only real lead they had so far, it could have gone just like this. Qui-Gon aligned himself with the Sith, got the genetic base of Anakin, handed it off to someone, and then was killed by the Sith. There was another scenario that the Sith were the reason for Yaddle's death or Dooku's betrayal, but it was an investigation. Everything, regardless of how plausible it could be, had to be looked over. Temple records from that year would be brought up, and the Council would learn that aside from talking over with Obi-Wan, Jocasta Nu, and the Council, Qui-Gon had spoken extensively with Yaddle and briefly with Dooku. Other names of potential interest were Tyrannus and Sifo-Dyas. Even though the Council was looking in the right places for the wrong reasons, the trail wasn't exactly cold from where they started. As for Anakin, he wouldn't be in any trouble, despite how distrusting the Masters of the Council could be. They didn't necessarily believe Anakin to be so cynical as to agree to something as preposterous as a clone army at the ripe age of 9 or 10. Despite the Kaminoans not knowing a whole lot about the Force, they continued to do as Tyrannus requested. From Kamino for the last few years, leading up to the outbreak of the war, a group of elite clones had been gathered at the Mustafar facilities. These individuals were the most naturally gifted clones, and there were 6 of them at the moment. They were plucked from their ranks and trained rigorously by Sidious and Tyrannus. Ventress and Grievous did not know of their existence. Dooku kept a good eye on the Kaminoan facilities for more standouts, though. The Anakin clones on Mustafar, named CS-1 through 6, were trained as Sith, hence the name callsign CS, which stood for Clone Sith. The training they received helped them become adequate Force users and decent lightsaber wielders. But Dooku couldn't be on Mustafar the entire time, so holo recordings were saved and they studied off of them. This was part of the plan that Sidious had told Dooku about long ago. It was only one piece to the puzzle of galactic dominance. Back in the actual war, Anakin found himself assigned with a group of clones. Captain Rex, a Generation 1 Type A clone, was still the same, but their unit was quite hard for Anakin to interact with. He kinda felt surrounded by imaginary friends, but they were all alive, living and breathing individuals. It remained an unspoken thing, because how do you address your creator not knowing you exist nor really wanting you? It wasn't like a disrespectful thing, but Anakin was their age when his genes were taken, so it was really weird. But in avoiding this conversation, or even addressing the presence of this oddity, they remained focused on the combat of war itself. The only thing that got under Anakin's skin was hearing himself talk all the time. It did also misconstrue orders a bit, so they had to come up with methods of relaying command to other units, without it sounding like General Skywalker was doing it all the time. However, it did go to say that the war itself for the Republic was off to a much better start than it would have been otherwise. To say that the Anakin clones were better shots than the Jango clones would be completely inaccurate. They faced similar training, but with the Force at their hands, the clones were especially vile. This, more than anything, showed itself during space battles. Because despite the droids having a 10-to-1 advantage over the clones themselves destroyed droids at a 30-to-1 average, so it was a large difference from what the Sith predicted it would be. Like, for example, the initial battles of the war were meant to be crushing losses. No one planned for the Battle of Geonosis, but it was supposed to aid the Sith plans anyways. The clones were meant to lose a ton of battles. The Senate would give Palpatine more emergency control, and then immediately after, they would start winning, like they did at Geonosis. So, with Geonosis happening, it worked in their favor, in that scenario. But that didn't end up happening. Aside from the Military Creation Act and the initial emergency powers, nothing else was needed. The Senate felt comfortable in control. Their only challenge bureaucratically were the courts, but that wasn't a major concern inside the Senate at the moment. The point is, especially in space battles, the Republic was winning. The key to these victories were the dogfights. Even in being outnumbered, V-19 Torrents shredded Vulture droids and provided avenues for Y-wing bombers to decimate shield generators. The Republic frequently had smaller fleets, but the ability of the pilots aided them so much more. The Type A pilots were great. They typically, especially with the aid of the Type B, worked at a 19-to-1 average, but that was also off the success of the Force-sensitive fighters fighting with them. Almost half of all active forces had a higher than average sensitivity to the Force. Combine that with highly trained Jedi Generals, and the Republic was almost unstoppable. The Jedi investigation, on the other hand, wasn't going terrifically. Anakin still wasn't in trouble, but the lead investigator, Terrace Anube, also wasn't getting super far either. He and several counselors worked together to uncover this plot. The council was much more untrusting of the clones because of the Type Bs. They still played the part and earned the Senate trust by serving with the clones readily, but they couldn't trust the clones. And no, this had nothing to do with the fact that they were Anakin clones. It had to do with the fact that ethically, someone stole Anakin's DNA and used it for the clone army. The early and obvious potential culprits were Jedi close to Anakin. Through Master Sunubi's research, he found that Anakin wasn't especially popular as a youngling, so they couldn't rely on other Jedi being the culprit, or proof. All the youngling instructors were vetted, and so was the new counselor, Obi-Wan. Master Kenobi did inform the Jedi that Anakin, after the age of 12, had a tendency to sneak out, which is the truth. Obi-Wan learned but allowed a student to do it, under supervision. Anakin never found out, obviously. But despite this earning some backlash from the Council, this transparency did reveal that Anakin would have been too old at that time. Master Windu reminded them all of the celebration on Naboo. That and the actual battle a year beforehand were the two most likely places his blood could have been drawn from, unless anything happened on a field trip somewhere. Terrace Anube had found that during one of the Jedi trips through the city, Anakin remained close to a Jedi instructor, but he would have never been picked up from there, unless the teacher missed it, which she didn't. The blame therefore did circulate around Qui-Gon, Dooku, and Yaddle. One of them could have had something to do with this. Obi-Wan defended his master's name, but he did worry that maybe Master Jin was involved too deep. The problem is, the Jedi perhaps had more respect and trust than ever before inside the Senate, or at least since the Old Republic or High Republic. So, if they revealed this bombshell too early, they might damn themselves to more critiques and external reviews. There had to be some way to frame it, if the truth came out that Jedi Master Dooku or Jin was behind this. They had to be wary with this line of thought though. Dooku and Qui-Gon were the only potential targets at play here. Former Queen Amidala was quite close with Anakin, but she was 15 years old during that celebration, and Master Kenobi didn't remember seeing anyone interact with Anakin. Senator Amidala tried to gather recordings from that specific night 9 years beforehand, but the files for that entire evening and year had since been removed from the archives. Obi-Wan used this to shift talk away from Qui-Gon and Dooku, but Ki-Adi-Mundi, a large critique of Dooku's habits, refused to move fully away from potentially blaming him. No one knew it yet, but Ki-Adi-Mundi single-handedly kept this investigation alive. With the war sliding closer to a clone victory, and the CIS using more of its reserve fleet than was intended, Sidious and Tyrannus converged on Mustafar. Their discussion wasn't related specifically to the clones present, but the Sith Lord had minor concerns with the Jedi Order. He suggested that Tyrannus use Ventress to target specifically the Jedi Council. Dooku worried that she wouldn't be up for the challenge, and that wasn't the point that Sidious was trying to make. Palpatine had overlooked some minor issues regarding the clones, and despite his master manipulation and his great foresight, he wanted to turn the Jedi attention away from potential culprits. He was informed recently that the Jedi Council had been asking about the celebration of Naboo's freedom from the Federation's blockade 9 years ago. Tyrannus remembered that event as the one where they gained the vial of Skywalker's blood. So, what were they going to do about it? Sidious wanted Dooku to spend more time personally on Mustafar, training these cadets. Lama Su would be tagging some potential interests for the CS program in the coming weeks. And on the larger side of the war, he wanted Asajj Ventress to target counselors and fully activate the reserve fleet. It didn't need to be stated in this conversation, but like the Sith plan regarding the clone Sith, Palpatine simply had to give orders and Dooku knew what to do and why it was being done. The activation of the reserve fleet revolved around the need to get Palpatine more control inside the Senate. There were new wartime bills being created by the Loyalist Committee, the same group under Senator Amidala's control, and they could reduce Palpatine's wartime power if the bills passed. As was ordered, Tyrannus would stay on Mustafar and the reserve fleet would activate, though it was to no aid that the massive separatist battlecruiser, the Malevolence, was also taken out, not even by Skywalker, but by a wing of the Type B clones. Their fleet was also destroyed in the process, but the Malevolence was lost, and Grievous almost was too. This victory, which was transmitted back to Coruscant, led to the finalization of the bill from the Loyalist Committee, that, in another war, wouldn't have gone through. Because the Republic had lost only around 10% of all battles waged since Geonosis, the Senate was comfortable with expanding Senate powers to reduce Palpatine's executive control. Because this was, unintentionally albeit, framed as a power grab, the Senate voted in majority to favor it. The Loyalist Committee was able to pass the Senate war package. It came with extra incentives for senators who wanted to stop the war to start the peacemaking process. The hopes were to pair up Republic senators with Separatist leadership and help them reintegrate. In thanks to efforts to bring the nation together, the Republic senators would earn extra bonuses for this reintegration program. In the war times, this was a bill to get the Republic to end the war before too much civilization was destroyed, while also encouraging that executive leadership didn't go too far with this emergency power. And even though this bill passed, it wouldn't be rescinded following the full activation of the Separatist Reserve Force, because its activation only boosted CIS victories up to 36%, which wasn't enough to win a war, just enough to elongate it. Anakin on the front lines, accompanied by Ahsoka now, trained his student rigorously. Though despite the new Jedi guidelines for the war, stating that Knights and Masters didn't have permission to train clones, Anakin took a new approach. Ever since being introduced to Ahsoka during the Battle of Christophsis and following it at Teth, he realized that his clones who showed signs could be utilized far more. Their training would be similar to Ahsoka's. Yularen of course hated it, but in Anakin's mind it was like a small Jedi academy. Skywalker instructed those who wanted to learn, and it was also used as an opportunity for Ahsoka to show some of her talents for instructing. It wasn't hard teaching for Ahsoka, it was more or less basic stuff, things that younglings would be taught. In a way, it brought the members of the 501st closer together, like a family would. For members like Rex, they didn't feel excluded, they just loved how their Jedi General took an interest in their brothers that had an affinity for the Force. That was something special, and all the clones recognized it. Whether they were Type A clones, Type B clones without the Force, or Type B, who had it but didn't want the extra training. This, while not an immediate change, did continue to make the 501st one of the most elite units in the Grand Army. But ironically, despite this call from the Council not allowing Jedi to train their clones, Anakin was not the first Maverick to try and train them. Individuals around the Order stationed with thousands of clones worked hard to help them. Even at times, Grandmaster Yoda found it difficult to not assist them. The innate sensitivity and empathy that every Jedi had encouraged them to be more open and welcoming to those struggling to use the Force productively. Part of this is because of the Kaminoan training. An individual might know the Jedi ways, or have killed a Jedi, but it did not make them understand how the Force worked. The more spiritual aspects of the Force were taught by various masters, in secrecy. The clones were very grateful, and they performed exceptionally. The Separatists may have been able to cling to a few more victories with the reserve fleet, but the clones were too good. Having the Force was the dagger in the side of the Sith. Terra Nube, on the other hand, came to the conclusion that Qui-Gon Jinn was responsible for the creation of Anakin clones. Master Shaak Ti was instructed to monitor every single transmission out of Kamino, and even after several important victories, the Council was inclined to bring Anakin to Coruscant for a short period of time. This quote-unquote grounding was not a punishment against him. The Jedi actually feared for Anakin's life, because of what Terra Nube had crafted in his investigation. This perhaps was the biggest flaw in Palpatine's plan. Choosing a former Jedi with over 60 years of information, data, and history for a Sith apprentice wasn't exactly his best bet. Terra Nube's concoction was founded in the wrong elements, but it technically wasn't far off. He had concluded that Qui-Gon Jinn, Sifo Dyas, and Dooku were working together to start a new Jedi Order. After Sifo Dyas' death, Dooku and Qui-Gon decided that it wouldn't be worth their effort until Qui-Gon found Anakin. It gets a little foggy here, but Master Sunube assumed that the clone army was meant to be their new Jedi Order. However, when Master Jinn died at the hands of the Sith, Dooku, in his anger, blamed the Jedi Order for not believing Qui-Gon, and then joined the Sith in hopes to destroy the Jedi, the Republic, and likely even the Sith after the war for Qui-Gon's death. There was plenty of evidence to prove that Dooku would go to extreme lengths for his student, because he loved Qui-Gon as if he were his own son. The Jedi Council fully believed this, and they brought Anakin home to protect him from the Sith apprentice, because he could see him as a threat that needed to die. Anakin believed the Council was being superstitious, but he was relegated to training Ahsoka inside the temple until further notice. This fear, while in Anakin's eyes seemed fabricated, was fairly placed by the Council. Why else would Dooku want clones of Anakin? Why else would Sifo Dyas hope to start a clone army? Not for a war. When Qui-Gon found Anakin, he and Dooku had a limitless supply of powerful Force adepts, ones that didn't need to be sourced from the galaxy. Something that the Jedi could also draw off of to support this was Sifo Dyas' unethical selecting habits seen in the book The Living Force. It wasn't beyond him to create an army of clones who had a chance at having the Force so that he and his friends could break away from the Council, the Order, and the Republic. Obi-Wan didn't want to believe that Qui-Gon could be so vile, but these motivations weren't exactly misplaced. All they needed to complete this was evidence from Kamino. Well, that news would come simultaneously with another development in a few days. Anakin, being Anakin, was looking for a chance to find freedom, and in doing so he saw something peculiar. An unmarked Republic transport landed inside of the workers' district on Coruscant. Who they were he didn't know, but he snuck out to investigate and enter the vessel. 3 Type B clones would enter the ship, and the vessel would launch into hyperspace. At the same time, the Jedi were getting confirmation from Shaak Ti. She had done some illegal digging into the Kaminoan archives. She learned of their unethical practices, and of course the transmissions from Tyrannus and Sidious. It became clear almost immediately that the Sith had constructed them an army. But furthermore, there were hidden transmissions between Tyrannus and Lama Su. This information would return to Coruscant, as a task force of Mace Windu, Kit Fisto, Ki-Adi-Mundi, and Depa Billaba would depart for Sereno to apprehend the Count. They needed him alive for a confession, to match the holograms found by Shaak Ti. Shortly after the Jedi Council left Coruscant to capture Tyrannus, Anakin's unmarked ship landed on Mustafar. He watched the clones ferry out one by one, as they were greeted by a hooded man on the landing platform. These boys had been hand-picked from the military base on Coruscant. They showed signs and were promised promotion to an elite squad of clones. Anakin followed them in without being detected, listening to Dooku's voice as he spoke to each of them. Inside the facility, these new trainees would meet the other CS troopers, and their new master. Sidious was on a hologram and telling them what their orders would be and their purpose here. The other 6 members stood around the hologram, watching their master speak. They were fully committed to this lifestyle, to the Sith. They were the Inquisitors of the Clone War. Before Sidious could fully explain everything, a blue lightsaber ignited, and they all turned back to face Anakin, standing in the doorway. Skywalker was able to grab the coordinates from the hologram by tracking it, and he transmitted them to the temple with an embedded code. The Jedi would be able to intercept it and visit whoever was on the other side of the hologram. Anakin looked at his clones, demanding that they all stand down. The 3 new ones didn't understand the meaning of this. as the other 6 did, igniting crimson sabers and storming past Dooku. The Count quickly shifted towards the new members and explained everything to them, as he turned the hologram off, and the sabers behind him started to clash away. Anakin didn't fear killing these traitors. Despite training with Dooku, they weren't going to be a big match for Anakin. He didn't let anger take over himself, he just steadied himself between their various assaults. His saber slipped between collisions and he spun away. Sometimes he'd leap over an attack or duck it, but he remained untouchable. Anakin batted his saber through a clone and forced another into the ceiling, snapping them out unintentionally as they hit the top of it. He weaved away, blocking forward and down under, before grabbing an assault and shoving their saber into the wall and slicing through them. Anakin felt powerful and unstoppable, but he was controlled. Everything about this clone war had given him control. The trust with the High Council, the clones who listened to his command and his teaching, their constant flow of victories. Anakin may have not been his best self as a warrior, but he was the most confident he had ever been. The remaining CS troopers would be dealt with, and he would approach Dooku. The new recruits he brought from Coruscant chose the Jedi path instead, and rejected serving the Sith. As a result, they were executed with the swing of Dooku's saber. He then told the boy that he should have never come here, and Anakin gritted his teeth, speaking through with a deep murmur, telling his opponent that he should have never taken his blood. Their weapons slammed together. Across the galaxy on Coruscant, Master Yoda gathered what warriors he could. Emo Gundy, Obi-Wan, Pong Krell, and Kit Fisto would be accompanying him. They would deal with Skywalker's break of curfew later. There was a transmission coming from inside the industrial sector that needed to be dealt with. They rushed into a Jedi shuttle and departed across the city to stop the individual Anakin called a Shadow. Skywalker and Dooku slammed their blades down into a control panel before Anakin was backhanded across the cheek and his attacker pursued him, shoving him out onto the walkways. The shields slammed to a halt and they repulsed in fury as fire exploded around them. Anakin and Tyrannus paid little attention to any of it as they continued to trade blows with each other. Dooku took on an offensive position and shoved Skywalker backwards across the exterior of the facility. Anakin was still not ready for this fight, and he was far from ever beating a still healthy Dooku. However, call it divine intervention or the Force itself, but the cut done to the shield generator panel allowed a blast of fury from an exploding volcano to spew lava down on the uncovered walkway. A chunk landed between them, and Dooku spun around it before getting nailed in the shoulder by fire. His robes lit up, and he removed his cape in a swift move, but Skywalker shoved forward, connecting with his opponent and pushing him back. The tide changed immediately, and Dooku tried to bat Anakin away, until Tyrannus slipped and was knocked off balance. Dooku fell backwards, and with a short push of the Force, Tyrannus would fall down into the lava river and get absorbed. The clashing of sabers, though, continued, just not on Mustafar. Sidious was cornered like a rabid animal, and he raged, flinging himself at his opponents, but they surprised him. He was preparing to leave and address the Senate with a new bill, and he got attacked. He fought back the aggressive Jedi, but the combination of Yoda, Krell, Fisto, Kenobi, and Gundy would be too much for him. They were all attacking Jedi, as Fisto and Kenobi held the outskirts of the fight to prevent their opponent from leaving. Palpatine put up one hell of a fight, and he did everything he could to stop the Jedi from destroying him, but it proved to be useless when he was cut down. Yoda didn't necessarily plan on allowing him to testify, so it didn't really matter that he was disposed of the way he was. The end of the Clone War didn't come with a peace treaty. Even with Dooku's loss and Palpatine being replaced at the same time, the Republic couldn't get a peace treaty. Instead, the Senate bartered for more control and reduced the Chancellor's role to a spokesperson position, something Sly Moore would be able to fill in for the time being. The evidence found against the Kaminoans would be held against them, and before Lama Su could do something erratic like execute Order 66 with the actual command inside of Kamino, he'd be killed by Shaak Ti. It wasn't something she was proud of, but she learned of the executive orders, and in learning of who could activate them, she killed him. He was about to do it himself because the Kaminoans needed failsafes. He, the Republic Chancellor, and Nala Se could do it. Theoretically, anyone could execute the right orders with the right words, but point being, the main threat was dealt with. The Jedi Order would take control over Kamino until the end of the war. When the peace times came, they would inform the Senate, quietly, about what they found, and the Senate would agree to keep the information from the public. Thanks to the effort made by the Jedi Order to restore peace and maintain civility with the Kaminoans until the end of the war, the Senate awarded them with the budget they had once been promised under the banner of High and Old Republics. They would have more freedoms to be the order they needed to be. However, this came with a slight cost, as all things do in a government. The Jedi were incentivized to take on 20% of all clones in the Grand Army of the Republic. Those who showed signs of the Force were to become Jedi or serve the Order. That was a huge undertaking, because it meant that around 200,000 clones would come under the protection almost immediately. But the full body of the Jedi Council, with the aid of the overly powerful Loyalist Committee, would make it work. Anakin opted to stay on Coruscant where the clones wouldn't be, because it was a little much for him. But the Jedi Order would open up several branches in former temples and outposts. Across the rims, the Jedi would become present again. The slave, once owned by Jabba the Hutt, became his biggest nightmare, and the Jedi clone force would work to optimize Republic influence in the Outer Rim. It wouldn't be a full-blown invasion, but the linking between the Jedi and the Senate encouraged the Jedi to get a little more testy with their influence. They were able to accomplish more due to the gaps in the Chancellor's office. All the work done by a Loyalist Committee to strip executive powers from Palpatine gave the Jedi the chance to get representation, which they got. The aforementioned partner program to incentivize reintegration from separatist systems would be very popular inside the Senate, and would help ease tensions quicker. Eventually though, the Chancellor's office would gain more power, but by that point, the Jedi were a part of the Republic officially. The war was at an end, and the galaxy was reunited. Anakin, during this turbulent time, would return to the Order as a hero. The Council would promote him to the rank of Master, despite training Ahsoka at the same time. This was because of his effort and his collected mind during everything, especially with so many clones stolen from him. Anakin, though, held a deep love and respect for his clones, both Type A and Type B, because they were all valiant soldiers. He and Padme would avoid having children for a couple of years, just because it was a little weird having a bunch of Anakins all over the place. But once the Grand Army slowly broke up, and they integrated into the galaxy as Jedi or workmen, it'd be easier. Ahsoka would never leave the Jedi Order, nor be inclined to, and the lineage of the Sith came to an end without anyone knowing. In the eyes of the Jedi, that was a fitting end for an order bound to chaos. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Let's talk about this story. My biggest inspiration going into this, ironically, is Attack of the Clones. I love Attack of the Clones, it is my favorite prequel movie, and I really love how the mystery is kind of done in it. It could be better, admittedly, but I really like the mystery in it, and that was the main inspiration for this story in particular. I really wanted the unreliable narrator thing to be present, especially for the Sith plan. The Sith plan, more or less, and it's not really said in the video intentionally, I wanted you to come to the conclusion yourselves, but the Sith plan itself is more or less, they wanted to create a Sith clone army. That is the irony of it all too, because the Jedi Council, in all fairness, and I think rightfully assume, that Sifo Dyas, Dooku, and Qui-Gon would try and start their own clone Jedi Order. That's the irony in all of this. The Sith create the army, send them the war is meant to go the same, but in the end, they're gonna have a clone army of Sith Inquisitors, basically. The survivors of the war essentially become the next leg of a Sith Empire. But that never happens. And I kinda like that the Jedi never really fully grasp what happened. Like, I don't really believe personally in this story that anyone would actually learn that Palpatine was behind it. Like, after he's killed, obviously, like, oh, he's the bad guy, but like, I still think they would think that Qui-Gon Jinn was the one who took Anakin's blood and sent it to Kamino. Which is a shame because it does make Qui-Gon out to look like the bad guy, but I think it's an interesting perspective for the Council to take on, especially with the evidence they have. You know, Dooku, Qui-Gon, Sifo Dyas, they are kind of the Mavericks, and it wouldn't technically, in all fairness, be beyond them to do that. So I hope you all enjoyed the story, a little bit of mystery there. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.